You're listening to Knowing Faith, a podcast of the Village Church. This is Kyle Worley, and I'm joined by my co-hosts today, Jen Wilkin and JT English. And on today's episode, we talk about the book 2 Samuel. Now, one of the reasons that we're doing this is because kind of the arc of knowing faith in a given season is we kind of trace whatever Bible study our church, the Village Church, is doing at that time. And so you can follow along with this. You can find curriculum and audio for the 2 Samuel Bible study online at tvcresources.net. But on today's episode, we introduce 2 Samuel, and we really talk about why 2 Samuel matters. Okay, so when we came in to record today, Jen was insulting the music I was listening to, which is, listen, I'm the butt of the insults in this room, and I'm owning my position there.
Come on.
So, Jen, what kind of music do you listen to?
Oh, just classical.
That's not true, is it?
I'm kidding, but I have pretty nerdy musical taste. I mean, I like old stuff, and then whatever my kids have introduced me to.
Oldies.
Mm-hmm.
Oldies.
What have your kids introduced you to? I know they listen.
That trap music?
They're like, oh, man.
Okay, so
don't do it, Mom.
No. Well, we had a really funny thing happen recently where we were at a wedding, and one of the moms, it was like this whole group that we were all in a home group together years ago. We raised our kids together, and one of the kids is getting married, but one of the moms is sitting next to my son, and she says, well, my son went through a really rough period. He was listening to rap music.
Oh, gosh.
And Matt Wilkin, his whole face just like blanches, and I was like, uh-huh.
Really
So I would not listen to everything that the kids kids today listen to. But the other thing is like my kids are at school at A&M, and country music is a big deal. Country dancing is a big social element of being down there, so I'm being introduced to
A lot of Florida, Georgia line down there.
No.
Pat Green?
Yeah.
Is that I don't know country music. So a couple of years ago, for one of the Village Church's like staff Christmas parties, there was like a cover band. Do you guys remember this?
Yeah. Yes.
And they were playing George Strait songs.
They did a great job.
Now, I walked in and I was listening to it, and one of our staffers, prominent staffer, came up to me and was like singing the song, and I was like, how do you know this song? And he was like, well, it's George Strait. And I was like, oh, I know George Strait. He sings that song. There's it's Morning in Amarillo. And the guy was like, what? I was trying to like really level with him. I was like trying to be like,
I get it. I know country
I
music.
get George Strait. Yeah, the Morning in Amarillo. And he was like, are you talking about Amarillo by Morning? And I was like, oh yeah, I guess so. Is that the name of the song?
Yes.
Okay, great. See even
I think. I'm not.
You're not
this is
into
me
country
trying to
music?
level with you.
You remember, Kyle, when you used to write blog posts about Jay-Z and Hosier? How do you say it?
Hosier, I think.
Hosier?
Yeah.
Hosier.
Yeah, so I wrote a blog post at the time that Jen was the editor of the blog, and she goes, Kyle, no one knows this song or this artist. The song went on to be like the #1 single of that year. So I'm not going to say I'm a prophet.
Actually,
but,
I really like them now.
Well.
Thanks for introducing me to
Yeah.
Hosier.
You're welcome. You're welcome. JT, what kind of music you into?
Here's what's weird. I honestly...
Jock jams?
Wow.
Right, yeah.
I hate this question because I just don't... The music I probably listen to most is like instrumental. Like I love just listening to stuff when I'm either doing emails or reading or whatever, that kind of stuff. I don't listen to a ton of stuff.
But when you are working out, though, you have told me you're very committed to listening to Miley Cyrus.
It's just one of those things that just pumps me up. Hey, I will say this though. There is I feel like this is like sacrilegious to say on a podcast.
Like, yeah.
Oh, Jen is singing the whole song.
Like, yeah.
Okay.
Jen taught our staff how to Dougie a few weeks ago.
No,
she's
that's
into
a
this
lie.
more than she's in.
That is an absolute lie.
I'm
a
glad,
Baptist.
I'm glad that image is not in
right.
my...
Hey, I actually do want to give a shout out here to a group that I have been listening to.
Okay.
I feel like this is sacrilegious for a pastor to say. I don't always love worship music. Like I hear worship music. I know that's weird to say.
At this revelation.
Right. There is a band, City Alight. out of Australia. They are just fantastic. Macy and I have
you turned me on to them. They're fantastic.
Macy and I have been spending a lot of time listening to them. If you're in our house at night, we typically have that on, like just kind of on Sonos in the background or whatever. And it has been, if you are looking for a good worship band, City Alight is doing a fantastic job.
Maybe we can get Kyle to write a blog post and catapult them to number one.
You know what? Is that what happened the first time around? I didn't know my blogs were that influential. Hey, listen, we're glad that you're listening to Knowing Faith. We are talking about 2 Samuel today. And you might be thinking, why are we talking about 2 Samuel? So why are we talking about 2 Samuel?
Because that's what we're doing in Bible study, and we're pumped about it.
I really respect you, Jen, like a lot, and I like you as a friend. And I still cannot get excited about 1st and 2 Samuel.
JT is still harassing me because we didn't do Isaiah.
Yeah,
he will
in the back of my
shut
mind,
up
I'm thinking
about
to myself,
Isaiah.
we could be talking about Isaiah right now.
But we're going to be knee deep in 2 Samuel.
2 Samuel, gosh, I feel like I'm like really bordering like heresy line this morning. I like 2 Samuel, always more than 1st. I think there's
You like 2 Samuel more than 1st?
Here we go.
That's like saying I like the end of Gone with the Wind better than the beginning.
Oh my goodness!
It's the
Here's
same
the thing.
book.
I've not read it, so
It's
that
like-
means nothing to me.
Yeah,
You don't choose the end of a book over the beginning
I
of a book.
resonate with John Wick 2 a lot more than John Wick 1.
Okay.
And I think it stands on its own. So if somebody was like, hey, I'm going to watch these John Wicks, I'd go watch the second one.
But this is one story.
I'm not saying that I don't like the first part of the story.
I'm
saying I'm excited to finally be in 2
there's no such
Samuel.
thing as 2 Samuel.
Ooh, this is a great place to start.
Okay.
Okay, so
Jesus, Jude.
but hold on, Jen. When I open up my Bible, there's a like a page demarcation,
Right.
And it says at the top of it in big bold letters, it says 2 Samuel. So when you say there's no such thing as 2 Samuel, is the Bible lying to me?
Yes.
Oh
no,
my
of course
gosh.
not. No, it's just it was due to scroll length when it was originally written down, and so it's broken up in a logical place. Like whoever was trying to fit it onto the scrolls broke it up in a logical place. But really, it's just the book of Samuel.
What do you mean by that? Scroll length. Like,
so when it's being written down, instead of just so it's compiled from can I say this? It's compiled from some different sources into one book, right? People know that,
well,
right?
Let's pause here. So there are a lot of times when we approach the Bible and we get to a book of the Bible, and this is particularly true of the historical books in the Old Testament and the Torah, okay? But there are many folks who would look at these books of the Bible, and there are some who would say these books were a unified whole written by a single author, and that single author was X. And there are some books of the Bible where that is uncontested and very clear. There are other books of the Bible that appear to be the accumulation of a variety of sources. And as Christians, we believe that typically evangelicals who hold a position like that, I know that this is what Jen would say, is that accumulation of these various sources was done under the inspiration of God, and that the books themselves are no less inspired or authoritative than any other book of the Bible.
Right. It's not a threat to inerrancy or inspiration at all to say that.
So I'm sorry to cut you off there, but you were talking about how they were assembled together by a variety of sources.
So basically, Samuel and Chronicles and Kings were just Samuel and Chronicles and Kings, but when they were physically written down, they took up more than would fit on one scroll, and so they're broken up for us into two parts.
So the division here is largely just like incidental to how they were having to be written down.
Yeah, although I'm sure thought was given to where you were going to put the division.
Right, of course.
Yeah.
So what is second Samuel? JT,
It's just a continuation of the story that we've left in 1 Samuel. It's hard to understand 2 Samuel, and this is not just true of 2 Samuel, but any book of the Bible outside of its context. So this is a book that's helping us understand the promises of God that specifically were given to Abraham in Genesis 12 and their continual unfolding. So just 30-second overview, promise given to Abraham, you will be a nation that's going to bless the nations, and all people will be blessed through you. I'm going to give you land. I'm going to be with you. And ultimately, this is the promise of restoring God's kingdom. Abraham's family ends up in Egypt. A deliverer is given to them to take them back to God's promised land, and through this conquest, they They somewhat kind of partially inherit this land, and they begin setting up a government for themselves. This is Joshua and Judges. And then ultimately God's people say, we want a king. We want a king like the other nations. This king is going to give us economic security, military might, ultimately to establish God's kingdom. But this isn't the way that God had it, so God anoints another king for himself. It's kind of this, and these are two of the major characters in these books, Saul and David, of which one is a king that is God's king. Right. And how is God going to reign and rule over the nations and bring blessing to the nations? And so in 1 Samuel, we see Saul's kingdom, and Saul is trying to kind of establish his authority and establish Israel as a kingdom and defeat the Philistines. But ultimately, this shepherd boy we find is going to be the king, and he is the one who's anointed by Samuel, the prophet. And so ultimately, 2 Samuel is kind of this juxtaposition of these two kings, Saul the first and David the second. And what is the question as we open up the book in 2 Samuel is God going to establish his kingdom through David?
Right. And if just as a kind of a note here for resourcing, but if you're thinking, well, hold on, you guys are talking about 2 Samuel, but I'm now feeling like I have to listen to some stuff or look into some stuff about 1 Samuel before I jump into this and follow along, because this will be an arc that we're tracing over the course of the spring semester. We'll be following along with 2 Samuel. And so the kind of rhythm of Knowing Faith is that like every other episode is going to be focused on whatever book we're studying at the time. And this semester it's 2 Samuel. So you're going to hear a lot about 2 Samuel, and we're going to be going through chunks of the story as we release Knowing Faith episodes. But if you want more of it, if you want some of the lead up to 2 Samuel, you can find the curriculum for the 1 Samuel Bible study that the Village did last semester. This would be the fall of 2018. You can find that curriculum at tvcresources.net along with audio and video to accompany the actual classes.
I think just audio right now. Video will come eventually.
Okay, so audio right now. You can find the audio for those classes. You can listen to some gifted teachers here in the Life of the Village teach through 1 Samuel. And then we also did a series of Knowing Faith episodes, one to introduce 1 Samuel, and then episodes through some kind of big
major
chunks.
Themes.
You can find that on the Knowing Faith feed. So JT, you did a great job of giving the story so far when we arrive at 2 Samuel. Jen, can you maybe point out what are going to be some of the what are some of the big things happening over the course of 2 Samuel? Is there a mega theme that's being continued from 1 Samuel? Are there these big pillar moments? Is there something huge that's happening in redemptive history?
This is a major transitional book, right? So it comes on the heels of the book of Judges, which is a study in chaos. And the judges were the functional rulers of Israel, but they were ruling over, individual areas. There was no cohesive approach to rule. And the book of Judges paints just an alarming and terrible picture of what it looks like when the people choose to go their own way, when the judges choose to serve their own ends instead of God's ends. And it leaves you saying, well, that didn't work. Now what? Right. And so then we have the introduction of Samuel, and he is the last in the line of the judges, and he transitions the kingdom to the monarchy. And as JT was pointing out, you get this, the people say, we want Saul, and Saul's name even means asking. And so he is the ask of their asking. And then in contrast to that, then you have David, who we know him best as a man.
After God's heart.
After God's own heart. But one of the commentators that we got into last semester, and honestly, this has really shifted the way I even think about the whole structure of the book, said that a better way to hear that is the man of God's choosing, which makes sense if you lay him in contrast to Saul, which is exactly what the book is doing. So you have the man of the people's choosing, and then David is the man of God's choosing.
Can I just say something too?
Yeah.
That's helpful too, because that man after God's own heart line gets thrown around by David so often. And then you have to end up explaining away a lot of David's life, because you're like, then people are like, but isn't he a man after God's own heart? Right. And didn't he commit adultery and kill this guy?
And in a lot of ways, his sin is greater than Saul's sin.
Right. So
it's more egregious.
We have to tackle this semester.
And you're like, well, who is God if this is a man after God's own heart? Oh, yeah, okay,
no,
that's
totally.
really helpful.
I think it's a massive distinction, and I'm really curious to see what more I can find that's been written on it, because it was like, oh, shoot, that really makes this whole book make way more, and the story of David make way more sense because you're able to take him off the pedestal,
right.
and which is what we need. And that's why I love doing this book, even though JT wanted us to do Isaiah.
Hey, this is a great book.
Is because we think we know these stories, and the way that we have learned them is there's a good guy and there's a bad guy,
right.
and David's the good guy and Saul's the bad guy. And so let's see how many rocks we can throw at Saul and how many accolades we can give to David. And that is such an overly simplistic view of how the story plays out. And I mean, we're going to have to really spend time this semester staring hard at not just what David does, but how David gets to the place of doing what he does. And there will be things to celebrate, and there will be things that are very sobering and instructive.
So you have David as a major character.
Right.
Who are some of the other major characters that people might just, like, either they might know of or they should be on the lookout for as we get into 2 Samuel?
Well, David's sons are going to be an interesting picture for us. They're gonna speak a lot to that most frightening parenting principle of all: more is caught than taught. So you'll see Absalom, end up trying to take over the kingdom and all the heartbreak that comes out of that. And then you'll see how Amnon treats his sister. And another thing that I think we'll get to do is spend some time paying attention. So in the book of Judges, there's this theme of sort of watching the women and seeing how the women are treated, and the whole idea that the way we treat the most vulnerable among us is the indicator of how civilized a society we are. That's kind of a generally accepted principle by believers and unbelievers. And so I think if you pay attention to the story arc, not just of the kings, but also of the vulnerable, it says a lot about
That's good.
about what's being communicated. So if you continue that from Judges into Samuel, which I think is appropriate from just a literary standpoint, so we get to pay attention to Micah, to Bathsheba, to Tamar, and ask some questions to David's concubines, even to the way that David thinks about marriage.
Right.
Which
Nathan's going to play a huge role.
Oh, yeah. I mean, yeah. And connecting those stories. So, like, I think one of the most common things that you see done with the stories that are in 1 and 2 Samuel is they're just presented as standalones. And so one of the things I'm looking forward to getting into is that we will not have permission to read the story of David and Bathsheba without immediately reading the story of the rape of Tamar and saying, how do these two stories connect to one another is going to be really important.
Yeah.
We want to take a moment to make you aware of our sponsor for Knowing Faith this season, the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary in Louisville, Kentucky. And some of my favorite people came from there.
Really? JT, did you go to Southern?
I went to Southern. I had a fantastic experience.
I did as well, but I didn't go as far into it as you did.
Hey, but you gave it a valiant effort.
Oh, thank you.
If you're thinking about doing further education, we hope that you're doing education in your church. But if you're looking for that next step, Southern's a fantastic place.
Yeah, so if you want to find out what makes Southern Seminary unique, you can visit them online at sbts.edu. And if you decide to apply, you can do so for free with the offer code KNOWINGFAITH. Again, the address is sbts.edu.
Jen, this might be, I think I can ask this question. What do you think the main question in terms of like the biblical storyline is as we come to 2 Samuel? What should people be expecting to either be left in tension or to be answered by the end of the book?
Who is the rightful king?
Yeah.
Is the question, right?
And what does God's kingdom look like?
Yeah.
I think so.
That's good.
Because you think about, we talk about 2 Samuel 7 a lot. With God making covenant with David. And how important that is for the rest of the redemptive storyline of Scripture. Right? And in some ways, and we've talked about this, I think we talked about this a little bit, I could be misremembering, when we were doing our podcast on 1 Samuel. But one of the big things that's happening in the historical books that we often miss, and it's because we have a truncated view of the story of Scripture, because our view of the gospel is typically what I would say is a faithful, very right next to me view of the gospel, which is like the gospel is primarily God is saving me through his son Jesus by the power of the Holy Spirit. That is kind of the gospel at like horizontal level right here. But the 30,000-foot view of the gospel, the good news is that God is establishing his kingdom over the whole world.
Yeah.
That's right.
And if you're an Israelite, when David shows up, well, first off, when Saul shows up, you are sorely disappointed that God's kingdom now lacks a king again. And then when David shows up, you're thinking, this is it.
This is it.
We are going to have God said he was going to establish his kingdom over the whole world.
And
He's
they
with
lived
us.
happily ever after.
We're going to build a house for him.
right.
The king is on the throne.
So it looks like, I mean, if you put yourself in a position of an Israelite who has been soaked in the story that Yahweh has been telling his people, whose generations have experienced the exodus from Egypt, you've been freed from slavery, God has put you in a land, and he's now given you a conquering and faithful king, conquering and faithful both being in kind of air quotes there, okay? Because it's not all that it seems to be, and the reader gets to see that before the actual people would have felt that. But is that like, oh, we're here.
God's kingdom has been established.
The promises are being fulfilled right now.
Yep.
Here we go. With the construction of the temple is going to be like a kind of a crown jewel in that element. But David is certainly giving that impression. And if you're just following along, if you don't know the whole story, you could get to 2 Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings, which are a good accompaniment to it, and go, well,
Is the Bible ending?
Yeah.
I'm serious.
For sure.
That's what you should be feeling. It's like, oh man,
We
what
did
he
it.
promised to Abraham, God has accomplished.
Yeah. Here's David, and here's a kingdom, and we're a people, and we have a land, and we miss a lot of that because it's not something we're even trained to expect.
Right.
And yet they would have been feeling it in a very pronounced way. So let's talk a little. This is not in our notes, and so we might find ourselves in trouble. I want to ask the question because I think when people read, particularly the historical books, they go, what does God do? Like, what is God up to in all this? Like, if God, like, why do we care about this? Where is the voice of God? You don't really hear God. I want to be careful how I say this. There is not direct, immediate speech from God often in the historical books, being like you have passages that say God said or God spoke, but you have these stories and they're kind of cascading. So what is the role? We talked a little bit about this in 1 Samuel, but for somebody jumping into 2 Samuel or following along with us, what's the role of God in a book like 2 Samuel? Does the question make sense?
Yeah. Well, one of the things that we've been pressing on in the study is that even when God is silent in the narrative, his sovereign hand is evident in the way that the story is being told.
That's great.
So he's always working behind the scenes, even when, you could argue, in the book of Judges, he's largely silent in a literal sense, but he is certainly speaking and acting all the way through the book. And so that's a muscle that we need to flex when we are reading these kinds of texts, is even when God is not speaking. And also, like another thing, this came out when we were studying Genesis as well. Look for the chapters or the portions of the text where God drops out of the narrative, because those are usually the most violent, the most dark moments in the text. And a picture is being painted for us of, when the people shift their focus away from the Lord, this is what happens. Right. And then even when your sense that, he's working behind the scenes has returned to the text, then you can look for the story to pick up with, there's hope to be traced here. And so, I think rather than feeling like, oh, God wasn't in that chapter, it's asking, how is God in the chapter, even if not explicitly presented to us as so?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't have a different answer for that. That's great. But one of the instincts that has built in me as I think about that is a reminder of God's patience in the midst of darkness, destruction. I mean, he just has been and continues to be patient with his people, far more patient than I can tend to be, or I imagine you can tend to be. Like when I see things going wrong, I'm like, let's fix it. Let's get it better. God, But just a reminder that God is long-suffering. God is patient in the midst of incredibly horrific sin and walking away from God's plan. He just continues to even use what we intend for evil for the kingdom and for good.
Right, and the historical books, just to kind of come alongside, those are both excellent. I don't have anything to add. The historical books, though, will frustrate our attempt to make the Bible apply to our life. This is why I feel like most people drop out in the historical books in their Bible reading plan, or they get that, or it can lead to some really messed up stuff. So, like, the historical books are descriptive and if they're prescriptive in any manner, it's usually from a principle perspective and like a don't do this kind of thing. But they're not self-consciously prescriptive. That's not the genre that we're even dealing with, right? We talked about this in the last episode in terms of how to read the Bible. You read portions of the Bible like the genre calls you to read it, and the historical books will frustrate your attempt to go, what does this mean for me? Let me liberate you from something. Most of the historical books have no immediate application to your life.
That's right.
Is that fair?
It is fair. I will say we had Nancy Guthrie come in and do a training. She was here for an event that we did, which is fantastic, and you can find that online. It was our women's forum, but we had her do a training with our teachers and with regarding like the Davidic covenant and some content around Samuel. And one of the things that she helped with in terms of making application is she said our tendency is to look at David and say, how should I be like him? And we talked about this some in a previous episode. That's not wholly wrong, because if David is like Christ in some way, we should want to be like Christ, and we should ask those questions. But she said a better place to start is to say, what are the average people doing in this story? Because they're probably behaving the way that I behave. So, for example, in the story of David and Goliath, what are the Israelites doing? They're cowering and doubting the Lord. So the application I can take from that, rather than say, how can I take my slingshot and kill Goliath? Maybe I start with, how do I behave like the Israelites and doubt that the Lord is who he says he is.
Yeah.
So there are applications that can be drawn, but I think what I would probably say it this way. It takes a long time of sitting in the story, and I mean sitting in the whole story of Samuel, to be able to say, okay, this is the most, you might be able to draw an application. Is it the primary application? Is it the most important application? Probably not until you've sat in the story for quite a while. And, this goes back to what we talked about in our previous episode. You cannot rush application, which is my main beef with devotional reading. It's not that devotional reading doesn't have benefit, but it can tend to push us toward wanting to rush application, and we just don't get to do that. Sometimes it is easy and evident, but I think the Old Testament historical books, as you're saying, they're an opportunity for us to embrace the crockpot approach to reading the Bible.
There we go, crockpot approach.
Crockpot,
if you're listening, we will receive free crockpots.
No Instant Pot.
I want an Instant Pot.
There's no Instant Pot reading of 1st and 2nd Samuel.
Okay, perfect. Okay, why shouldn't I skip 2 Samuel in my Bible reading plan? Like, what am I going to lose if I'm reading the Bible and I see 2 Samuel's coming up in the beginning of March? If I'm reading through the Old Testament, that sounds about right. Why shouldn't I skip it?
I mean, there's a lot of themes.
Because I want to.
There's a lot of themes that you'll miss, but one thing that we have not talked a lot about, at least that I can recall, is 2 Timothy says that all Scripture is inspired and breathed out by God. So we never want to diminish any parts of Scripture. However, there are hot spots of Scripture where if you don't understand the kind of the major pillars or hot spots, all the other stories will cease to make sense. There is a hot spot in 2 Samuel, and it's 2 Samuel 7. You cannot have a full comprehension of the person and work of Jesus in terms of who he understood himself to be, who the disciples thought he was, and who his contemporaries thought he was, without understanding that text. That text is known as the Davidic covenant. I know we'll get to it later in a podcast, so we can cover it a little bit now or later, but this is one of the major pillars. If you pull this pillar out from the biblical storyline, what Jesus is doing ceases to make sense.
Right. Or that, or whenever, or we're not shocked, surprised, or interested when he says, I'm son of David.
Yeah, and so this is what's funny. This is how my worlds collide every year about this time. I am currently working on writing, along with the team, the curriculum for our fall study, which will be Acts. Spoiler alert. And so I spent some time looking at Jesus' ascension as I was putting together the homework yesterday. And the book of Acts, everybody would acknowledge, is a hinge book, like it's a birth narrative for the church, and the book of Samuel is a birth narrative for the kingdom of Israel. And what you see in the ascension of Christ is an enthronement picture that points back to Daniel chapter 7, and we'll get into that, when we start talking about Acts. But if we're going to understand what it means that Christ is enthroned and ruling then we need to understand these narratives that we're pointing toward that truth. And that's what Samuel is doing. It's setting us up for the understanding. You can't understand the New Testament without the Old Testament.
Yeah, that's right. And it's not just the Gospels picture of Jesus. I mean, there's people who as Jesus is walking by, will say, "Son of David, heal us," right? But it's not just in the Gospels. I mean, so Romans, which I think every good evangelical Protestant is going to say, this is the heart of the gospel.
Right.
This is where Paul is clearly communicating to a church what he understands the gospel is. What is his introduction? Paul, a servant of Jesus Christ, called to be an apostle, set apart for the gospel of God, which he promised beforehand through the prophets in the Holy Scriptures, concerning his Son, who is the Son of David. I mean, so Paul is setting up his entire understanding of the gospel based upon this hotspot in Scripture, 2 Samuel 7.
That's really good. Yeah, when people ask me, hey, how much of the Old Testament do I need to know to really be able to make sense of the Gospels? I'll often say, you can't get there without getting Genesis 1 through 15, the Exodus event, 2 Samuel 7, Isaiah, and Daniel. I feel like those are the big. I mean, like,
Would you add? I'm sure you would. Mosaic covenant.
Yeah, with the Exodus, the
You're
whole
including
book.
that. Yep.
Because those are like, if you miss covenant if you miss creation, and that Jesus is the better Adam, the last Adam, the true Adam, and that he's doing what Adam couldn't do, you miss it. If you miss that he's like fulfilling the Abrahamic covenant, you miss it. If you miss that he's fulfilling the Mosaic covenant and the greater Moses to lead his people out, you miss it. And then he's the fulfillment of the Davidic king and the promises of Isaiah and Daniel. Man, Jesus is like at every turn invoking that.
Yes.
Or somebody's invoking that about him.
Yep.
And so I really feel like 2 Samuel, in particular, 2 Samuel 7, which we're gonna spend a whole podcast talking about, the covenant with David. These are some of those things that it is really easy for us to feel like, okay, I don't see the immediate yield for me, and so I just need to move past it. But they are the things that texture the Bible, and they're kind of. It's almost like when you go see a beautiful piece of art. Like you go see like a beautiful painting. I did not know this until years ago. And so, but I was there and we were walking around with the museum curator and I was like, wow, this is really incredible. And, it's incredible how pronounced it feels off that they're able to do that. And he goes, well, you realize that there are like multiple textures underneath this, right? And I had no idea. I mean, I sound foolish saying that, but I had no idea. And a lot of times our story of the Bible is so thin and our Christian faith is thin because of it. And we need some of that rich texturing, and books like 2 Samuel do that.
Yeah. Just thought I'd throw in that David is mentioned explicitly over 50 times in the New Testament. And so I think we kind of encounter him just, at one mention at a time, and we don't always piece together just how large he looms over the New Testament insofar as he's pointing to Christ. So, yes, of course, we want to go back to that original story and know it because it's going to shape so much of how we then read each mention when we see him in the New Testament.
Yeah, it's good. Well, hey, to land the plane here. So if somebody's like, okay, enough of 2 Samuel. I can't do any more 2 Samuel. Let's land with something that's different. Are you guys reading anything good right now? Anything
I'm so
interesting?
proud of myself. Do you know why?
Why?
I know.
I finally finished Anna Karenina.
I felt like the Knowing Faith audience needed that update.
I just needed
Everybody
to say
takes
it.
a deep sigh.
Don't congratulate me. Don't tell me good job. It took me from January to December. And when I got done, I did not want to read another Russian.
Yeah, well.
I can appreciate it. Those of you who love the book, I get it. I loved the parts that were really good, but man, it was a slog. So now I'm reading, thanks for asking, All the Light We Cannot See, which won the Pulitzer Prize, and it is delightful. Not just because I just read Anna Karenina, it is so beautifully written. And I'm halfway through, so I don't know what's going to happen.
It's cool. You reading anything interesting right now?
Yeah. This isn't going to surprise anybody. It's going to feel super lame. One of the things that's been hard for me since I left kind of the academic world is just reading deep, rich theology on a regular basis. We're really busy in our work, and it's just, which I'm grateful for, but we've got lots of meetings, emails. I mean, our jobs are just like any job you might have if you're listening to this. And so for me, I decided this year to visit James K.A. Smith, and even Matt talks about this from the stage sometimes, having ancient friends, just friends that you can go back to, kind of his warm blankets. For Matt, it's Augustine. I love Augustine. But as listeners of this podcast might already know, I know the two of you do. It's Herman Bavinck for me. He's just somebody who met me. I read his book at an important kind of pivotal formative time in my life, and I've gone back to him this year. I'm reading his Reformed Dogmatics, 4 volumes through, just kind of have a reading plan, and it has already been, I know people are like rolling their eyes, that's fine. For me, it's been a consolation. It's been a reminder of the gospel, a reminder maybe even what God has called me to vocationally, of just thinking God's thoughts after that. Like, just what does it mean to be a theologian? What does it mean to be a theologian in the context of the church? The importance of the work, the humility of the work, the grind of the work. He reminds me of those things, and so I've really, really enjoyed it. I also do some Audible stuff. I've listened recently to a book called Them by Ben Sass.
My son just finished that. Yep. He's trying to get the whole family to read it.
Yeah, it was a really good book. Candidly, I preferred his previous book, The Vanishing American Adult, a little bit more, but it's not because Them wasn't good. So those 2 books have been really great also.
It's cool. Yeah. I'm reading Shoe Dog. Phil Knight, he's the guy who created Nike.
Yes.
So it's a memoir called Shoe Dog.
I bet that's great.
I love memoirs.
Oh my gosh, it's fascinating. He's a great writer, and it's a lot of fun to read. And the stories he tells about the guy, he spent most of his adult career working for a different shoe company, trying to sell somebody else's shoes in America. And it's fascinating. It's a really good book.
I have a theory that the only people who can write memoirs are people whose primary relationships have completely disintegrated.
Oh, wow.
Because then you can just say it. You can go, this person was terrible and they shaped me in terrible ways. And I'm like, oh, is that person still alive? Because you just wrote that in a book.
Yeah, sorry, Phil Knight.
I haven't read his book, but man, I've read some scorchers where you're like, you just said that out loud.
It's true. I also want to apologize to the Russian audience for Jen's comments. We love you. We don't care for your novels.
No. I did. I loved it. But I do think, don't you think that some of those people were writing during a time where editors were a little less fastidious? I was like, if I turned in this manuscript to my editor, he'd be like, oh, heck no.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah, that, and there was no Netflix.
Yes.
So
true.
Yep, there was an upside. Listen, if there's anything you heard us talk about on the show that you'd like to know more about, 2 Samuel, Russian novelist, you can find details on our website, tvcresources.net. On our next episode, and I know JT is excited about this. We're going to be talking about
I'm excited about all of them.
Christology.
But I do get particularly excited about that.
See you next time. Grace and peace.